Welcome to the GSC grants writing workshop, and thank you for taking time today. And thank you to our wonderful speakers for joining us and agreeing to walk us through this kind of very mysterious process. And yeah, before I give things off to Reed, who will be chairing today's event, I wanted to talk to everybody a bit about the GSC, the Graduate Student Committee of the Medieval Academy of America, and what we do, basically. So the Graduate Student Committee is a group of 6 graduate students, medievalists, from all disciplinary tracks. And we work together to offer a series of services all year round to our medievalist global community of graduate students, right? We have a quarterly newsletter that you should be seeing if you're a member of the Medieval Academy. We have a mentoring program, correct, that takes place at major medievalist conferences such as ICMS Kalamazoo, IMC Leeds, and the annual meeting of the MAA, in which we pair graduate students and early career scholars who are interested in receiving mentoring with more established faculty or professionals in different professional tracks. And we pair them and they meet and establish hopefully meaningful connections in this way. Lastly, we are active on social media and on Facebook and on Twitter. I will be sharing our links to those platforms as well in the chat repeatedly throughout today's session. And basically, beyond that, we also organize events at major conferences, but also professionalization workshops of different varieties, like the one you're participating in today. Okay, so yes, without further ado, I'm gonna pass the floor on to Reed. And yeah, thank you again for joining us today.
Yep, thanks, John, and hello, everyone. My name is Reed O'Mara, and I am a PhD student at Case Western Reserve University, and I'm also on the Graduate Student Committee of the Medieval Academy. Thank you all so much for being here today. Each of our speakers will go through their presentations, and then we will have time at the end for questions. Please feel free to make use of the Q&A function throughout the session, and keep your eye on the chat for links to various grant-related resources. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Marcia Kupfer. Marcia Kupfer contributes to the study of medieval art as an independent scholar based in Washington, D.C. Her many publications reflect wide-ranging interests in pictorial narrative, cartographic representation, spatial practices, and visual expressions of Christian-Jewish polemic. Her book on the Hereford map, in its triptych framework, explores the multimedia artwork as a vehicle for moralized optics. The 2016 study was awarded a prize from the Historians of British Art. She has received fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Humanities Center, as well as research grants from the American Philosophical Society. Dr. Kupfer, please take it away.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I just want to get access to my notes. So I'm going to be speaking about 2 things. First, how to go about organizing the application process, or at least how I've come to do it. Nobody ever gave me instructions on it, so it's just what I've been doing over the years. So after making sure that you've reviewed all the eligibility criteria for a particular grant, really do not skip that step, and making sure that the particular program is apt for your project and your career stage, whether you're a postdoctoral applicant, don't apply for a Guggenheim. You've got to really read the eligibility requirements. Then you'll want to review the component parts of the application. These will likely include a basic information form, an abstract, and various uploads that include a CV, a project narrative, a bibliography that may be attached to the narrative, a work plan, a writing sample, perhaps, and letters of recommendation. Before starting on any of the application process itself, the first thing you should think about is the letters of recommendation. That's what I would do. I would start strategizing that mentally. Who am I going to approach for that? You should identify those people and think about how to secure their support. Because if you don't have 2 or sometimes 3 letters, you can't apply. So for postdoc fellowships, I would assume that you have at least 1 letter already from a dissertation supervisor, but you probably need a second letter, and some applications require letters to come from different institutions or different faculties. So you might not be able to rely on a reader of a dissertation or someone else on your committee. And then if you're several years out from your PhD, I'd say at least 3 years out, you should start to look for other people who could be recommenders other than your dissertation supervisor. So let's say you've been networking and going to conferences and being in touch with other scholars who really are interested in your particular field. So how do you go about approaching them for a letter? So the way I've done it is that unless you know someone very well on a personal level, you should be prepared to write a kind of formal email request to that person that will already include a concise statement of what your project is and its contribution and what you hope to accomplish. At the same time, you don't want to put the whole application in the single email to make it all overwhelming. So you want to approach that person and see if they're willing to support your application. And then you can say that you can send them the full proposal and any supporting materials like a CV, chapters or publications in a follow-up email, depending on their response. And I always think it's nice to give the person you have approached an out. What if they can't write you a letter? They have other students. They might be applying for the grant themselves. They may be out of the country and not able to. So you want to say that you understand if they cannot support you write you a letter at this round or something. So you give them an out, and then you've sent off your email, you wait for them to get back to you. And if they say they can't help you out, you go down the next person on the list and don't waste time, fretting and personalizing and getting all upset about it. And then do follow up and send them the materials. Do not do it 5 days before the application is due. Give a recommender a month. I think it's only polite to do that unless it's someone who already has a letter for you on their computer, because these letters take a very long time to draft and they're really important to committees. Even when they're not required by an application process, panelists read them carefully and they take a lot of time to compose. So in effect, you have to have a process where you work on the project narrative a little bit before you approach your recommender, and then you go back and work on it, and you can send them a draft proposal. It doesn't have to be perfect, but something that really gives them what your project is all about, and they should have everything they need. I would just say that in some traditions, say Europeans have often if I've approached them for a letter, they've asked me to draft the letter of recommendation that they should send. That I don't think that's the American way of doing it. No American faculty or scholar has ever asked me for that. But sometimes German faculty will, that's just a tradition there. You can do something like that if that would help them if they ask you for that. Now I'll just move on to the next thing that I would talk about, the next section, which is understanding the odds of success and dealing with the rejection. So I just want to say that I looked up the NEH Division of Research Statistics, their fellowship program, which offers fellowship to university faculty and independent scholars. That's a combined senior fellows and people who are just out of their PhDs working on a first book. Don't ask me how this rationale for putting those two things together, but that's how it is. They say they have 1,120 applications per year in the last 5 years. There is a 7% funding ratio. So there are 79 awards a year. So basically, you have hardly any chance of success. I mean, maybe in good times, in fat years, a funding ratio would be like a 10% success rate. So you don't go into, say, a medical procedure knowing you only have a 10% chance of success and you devote all this, finances and resources for that. But think of it this way, that the application is a chance for experience. By writing a good project narrative, you get to know your own project better. You come up with ideas, you reframe it in a way that allows you to think how the different arguments fit together and how the parts go dovetail together. Also, you should do the best work that you can on an application, because your audience also includes your letter writers and the people on the committee who may not, the reviewers who may not themselves be deciding on the final funding decision. So they get to know your work and this seeps in. So you want to put your best foot forward always. And of course, that means you get more invested and a rejection will be that much more painful. But after a while, I guess you develop a thick skin, and now I don't even think about the rejections. I forget about them. Another rejection. I don't even, it's like hardly anything. I just wanted to make sure that I also, when you apply to something like the NEH, you are entitled to ask for feedback from the panelists. They write paragraphs. And if you have an unsuccessful application, you can see all those comments and they're very helpful. You can reapply. That's happened to me. In the second round, I've been awarded. The ACLS does also, for its various programs, give you feedback on an application if you ask. But all of the privates are like black holes. You throw in your application and you will never know why something was rejected or not. And I wish that there were ways of making the process more transparent. It's not because I think that that it's inevitably unfair. I just think that transparency would be nice. Most places do not even say how many applicants they get per year. I don't know why that should be a secret, but I've asked a number of places from which I've received awards. They don't tell you how many even applications for what awards. I just find that bizarre, but that's how it is. There are some very interesting new programs at the ACLS, by the way, for leading edge. There's something called a leading edge fellowships, which is they place new and recent PhDs in nonprofits for 2-year periods. So it's not a traditional research-based project. There are emerging voices fellowships. So the NEH has many different programs that are geared to different kinds of institutions. The HBUCs have a whole category. Community college faculty have their own category. Hispanic serving institutions have their own category. And then digital publications is something entirely different. So you should look exactly for programs geared to your stage and the nature of your project. And then the only thing that that I would say is that if it's a 7% success rate, not even reviewers will know why one application or candidate is successful and another not. It's really dispiriting, and I've sometimes declined to be reviewer anymore because it's just like you put in all this effort and then nobody you've ever liked has ever gotten anything. So I don't get it myself, but it's something I apply for a lot of things and don't get a lot of things that I try to learn from the experience. And I would also say that in our system, our social system, our capitalist system, and in academia, the rich get richer. You know, the more you have, the more you will get. And celebrity scholars are usually more successful in more rounds. And so it's a replication. It's unfortunate, but that seems to be the way that it is. And you know that it's not always the case that things in life are fair or just, or that the best or the worthiest prevail. So you just have to live your life. And that's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kupfer. Next up, our second speaker is Alina Gertzman. Alina Gertzman is Professor of Medieval Art and Archbishop Paul J. Hallinan Professor in Catholic Studies at Case Western Reserve University. In addition to numerous articles, she has authored many award-winning books, including Worlds Within, Opening the Medieval Shrine Madonna, The Middle Ages in 50 Objects with Barbara Rosenwein, and The Abstract Image, Lacunae in Medieval Books. She has also edited several books, including the 2021 volume, Abstraction and Medieval Art, Beyond the Ornament. Her work has been supported by the Guggenheim, Cress, Mellon, and Franco-American Cultural Exchange Foundations, as well as by the American Council for Learned Societies. In 2022, she was elected a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America. Professor Gertzman.
Thank you so much, Reed. I apologize if my sound is not perfect and you get to hear ambient noises, but my headphones died literally right before this workshop. I will attempt to share my screen, the words I really never want to say again. We can see things, yes? Yes, okay, glorious. So Professor Kupfer has covered quite a bit of what I was going to say, which tells you that, yes, it's 100% all true. And so my remit was to talk about the process and strategies for choosing a grant. And I will keep it very brief because we just heard about it. And then, of course, about the common mistakes that first-time grant writers often make. I can't help but wonder why I was chosen for this very unfortunate and, kind of a tragic role of explaining the mistakes, but I blame Reed for it, as always. All right, so then, why cannot I move this bloody thing? I can. All right, so very quickly, just to reiterate what basically has been said. So when you start researching things, before you start making mistakes, right? You need to research very basic things. So one, whether the fellowship application is initiated by your department. For an art historian, CASVA is initiated by the department. CRES Institutional Fellowship is initiated by the department. And a Graham Foundation. Or is it all up to you? Is it the student? So American Philosophical Society, for example, Chateaubriand Fellowship, the Institute of European History Fellowship. This is up to the student to start. You have to research the goals of your funding institution. This is so like Professor Kupfer, I was never really given a chance to attend such a workshop as this one. I was never told. My graduate program did absolutely nothing to train us in grant application. So one thing that I definitely did not know, and that is important, and that is researching the goals of your funding institution. Once, I got the ACLS grant precisely in looking at the ways of my project. How did my project enhance or advance their goals, right? So does your project do that? And the answer should always be a resounding yes, and you have to know how. Research exactly what and whom they fund. Now, again, we just heard the very sad truth, which is once you get one grant, you start getting others. There are universities that are seen as direct pipelines into different fellowships, right? So my institution was not. Boston University was not a direct pipeline. I was always the alternate when I was a graduate student. I never got a single prestigious fellowship, right? So, but we are going to imagine that in the fair world, everybody who puts together a good application gets funded. And so you have to ask yourself questions, right? Are you able to be specific about how their money will be necessary for your project? Are you able to be specific about your credentials? That is why you are the best person to complete your project. Are you able to be specific about their support? So what will this money allow you to do that you would otherwise absolutely, completely, utterly cannot do? Do not apply for a grant that is very obviously a poor fit, right? It is a waste of time for you. It is a waste of time for your reference letter writers, and it is a waste of time for your grant reviewers. But, and I want to stress this, do not dismiss a grant or a fellowship because you don't think it's the most ideal fit in the world, right? Sometimes you can stress a particular aspect of your research to get the money for at least some aspect of your project. Now, we very nicely, I think, segued into what not to do, right? Do not apply, do not dismiss. So I'm going to dedicate the rest of this, discussion to what not to do. What not to do, again, Professor Kupfer already told you. You have to be able to find proper letter writers, and you have to be flexible. Do not fixate on a particular group of people. Now, you just heard that 3 or 4 years out of your doctoral degree, you have to be able to find people other than your dissertation advisor to write for you. I had to do it right away. So network, it's hard. I cannot give you advice to not being shy, right? I was shy. I don't do well with small talk. But you must assemble a constellation of these letter writers. And depending on what you apply for, be able to pick and choose. Another mistake, as you just heard, is not allowing enough time for the reference writers to craft a meaningful letter. So I tell my students that they should inquire about one's willingness to write the letter about 6 weeks in advance of the deadline. I found this to be a sweet spot for myself. They vary. I would say that request the letter proper about a month in advance and be ready to remind us about deadlines respectfully. I will tell my students that, which is very true, is that I have very small head and I have a lot of students and I like constant reminders. I do. I don't take it the wrong way. If I'm reminded every day, it's fine. Another mistake is not sending your letter writers clean drafts of your application essay. I ask for all manner of relevant information. I do have a file filled with letters for my students, but I rewrite them almost every single time. So how many times have I rewritten letters for Reed? Every single time, because I want to tailor them specifically, right, to the application. It is a mistake to ask your letter writers to keep track of separate emails for each fellowship. It is a mistake to make us search for information online. You should give us the information. It should come, I like it to come in one single email packet so I know what to look for, again, because I have a very small head. So the upshot, as you can see, is not asking your reference letter, your writers like a week or two in advance, but also don't ask us 3 months in advance. I will forget. I just will. So that's references. Other common mistakes. When you write, you're putting together your letter, your application, and you are forgetting about your audience. You need to make sure that you determine your audience right away. Forgetting to do so in all my, I review a lot of grants. This is the mistake, really, number one for me. Are your readers within your field or outside it? And if you're applying, I'm using here our historical stuff a bit. So if you're applying for an ICMA CRES fellowship, these are the people within your field. If you're applying for the Getty ACLS, they are within your discipline, but perhaps outside of your field. If you're applying for American Philosophical Society, they're within the humanities, but outside your discipline. When you're applying for ACLS, you will be read by people who are outside of the humanities. So really attune yourself to who is going to be reading this. Another mistake is either writing for yourself or writing for really an idiot, right? So I've read both. I'm sorry. So if you're writing for yourself, your application is going to be very technical and no one can read your mind. It will make sense to you, but not to anybody else. I have also read applications where I was made to feel stupid because not because they were overly technical, because they were very condescending. So think about striking a balance. I know it's hard, but and explaining. I always think of it, write for an educated layperson at first, and then tweak it. Make sure you know how your project changes, what this reader, this layperson thinks about X, Y, and Z, and why this project matters for your reader's intellectual life. And at least this is what I look for. I suggest that you do not assume specialized knowledge on behalf of your audience. I'm a medieval art historian. I know very little about the finer points of insular metalwork, even less about late Byzantine mosaics. Conversely, do not assume that your audience consists of, rubes who wormed their way, as I say here, into academia and need an explanation for everything. All right. When you write, when you are actually getting into the structure of your essay, what are the common mistakes? One is meandering. Instead of determining your proposal's driving questions or key hypotheses or scholarly interventions or broader implications, right? Instead of making them immediately crystal clear to your audience, you meander. But I also suggest that you do not launch headfirst into specifics of your argument instead of crafting a short introduction to your general topic. So there's a balance again. There are numerous applications that I've read that get absolutely lost in the minutiae of historiography. Don't. Take as an example a few choice studies or introduce the readers to trends or schools of thought. One mistake that I see a lot in writing is indulgence in empty and vague cliches, and this has become more and more prevalent lately. I don't know why, but I honestly, if I read another application that promises to shed light on something or nuance something or shape something or even complicate something, I might scream. So don't. When you conclude, attempt to clarify again why your project is a game changer. Instead of writing a lengthy and poofy, grandiloquent conclusion that feels like a pillow stuffed with nothing, right? And I say this as a person who wrote about absent image and nothing, right? Be precise. And this is really my main advice, is being precise. The apparatus, the reference apparatus will change depending on the application, right? On the granting agency. I always suggest that you not make your essay footnote heavy because it bludgeons your reader. But I know that some will disagree. So what I tend to tell to my students is that you have to imagine your readers opening your project essay after a heavy lunch that includes some wine or beer. How will you engage this reader? Especially given that these readers have been reading hundreds of applications before, and they will read hundreds of applications after, right? Grab them. All right. I mentioned vagueness, which is my pet peeve. And this is really a last thing that I want to talk about. In writing your essay, 3 mistakes that I found most prevalent. One is not addressing your research process. How will you work? What is your methodology? How will you discover the things that you need to discover? Right? Your audience must be able to envision you at work. Don't make it too belletristic, happens, but also don't make your working method seem inert. The second mistake is not outlining your carefully planned work. You sit, you think about it, you outline it, and then it doesn't make it into that proposal. Your readers, again, need to envision it. What, when, how are you planning to accomplish what you set out to accomplish? Have you made contacts, art historians, at relevant museums and libraries? Do you know your archives? Do you know your shelf marks? Do you know your churches? Do you know your museums? Do you know librarians, archivists, and curators, small town mayors? It's very relevant for some of the things that you would research. So if I look at the application that gives me names, that gives me specifics, I am very comfortable saying, well, this person can just go hit the ground running and get on with it. And the last thing is not including a clear budget. You have to show that you've done plenty of research on the financial side of things. Try to estimate the expenses if you're asked for a budget, right? Try to estimate your expenses correctly. If it's too modest of an estimate, you risk not getting enough money to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Too generous of an estimate, that happens, and you will just make your readers laugh and shake their heads and reject you. So again, there is a balance. I think that I have exceeded my time limit. So I am going to pass the baton to my colleague who will actually tell you what to do instead of preemptively berating you for your mistakes. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Our third speaker is Sebastian Sebecki, who is professor of medieval English literature and culture at the University of Groningen. He specializes in English literature and literary history from Chaucer to the Reformation, especially archives and manuscripts, the ideas of authorship and literary culture, law and literature, political writing and intellectual history, and travel and global medieval literature. In 2016, he was awarded the John Hurt Fisher Prize by the John Gower Society. He has received grants from the British Academy, Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, Quebec's FQRSC, the German Research Foundation, and SAUTE in Switzerland. Dr. Sebecki.
Thank you so much, Reid. Well, thank you for having me here, and well, thank you also to Elena and Marcia for, I think, setting this up so well. I don't have a presentation. I will just talk about some general points. It'll be easy to take notes, I think, and jot some of those down. So I've been asked to talk about the differences in terms of grant speaking and grant writing, the differences to other types of academic writing. And I think to make this tangible, talk about the structure and the style of grantsmanship, of putting these applications together. So what I wanted to do is to talk you through the elements of the most complex of grants built around an individual's research ideas, right? So what I will say may not be relevant to, let's say, a simple fellowship application or a relatively modest grant or a grant that fits into a particular framework, but you can strip the parts out that make no sense. This is just assuming that, for instance, some of you may want to apply for these, really substantial grants that will run over, let's say, 3 to 5 years, that may involve you supervising, actually working with other colleagues as well. But there are nevertheless individual grants where you are the so-called PI, the principal investigator. So I'm just starting with the most complex of them in order to capture as many points as possible. And I really want you to think about, for a number of reasons, of applying for some of those grants, and not just those that can, let's say, bridge you, bridge a year or two. And I'm saying this because, having successfully applied for and received grants in North America, in various European countries, in the UK, on various levels. So these are, competitive fellowships, but also bigger grants. I do think that, especially in the dire academic job market that we're facing at the moment, there is a real case for thinking a little bit out of the box, and especially for applicants from North America. It's really worthwhile looking at what the European Research Council and individual European countries have to offer. These grants, even in a country like the Netherlands, have substantially more budget than the NEH or sort of Mellon can actually offer you. So let's say that recent PhD graduates, can compete for grants of of €1.5 million, which is a little bit more in dollars over multiple years. In other words, these grants can give you an academic post for 3 to 5 years with a full salary and with you having to do nothing but structured research on something that you want. And of course, that will lead to publications and other things. So I think it's a viable option for some of you. And I should also say that most of these grants, certainly the biggest ones in the EU, those ERC grants, but the same applies to most German grants and Dutch grants and elsewhere too. They're open to any nationality, and you don't have to be based in Europe at the time at which you apply. But you will need to find a host institution that will want to take you. So I will just simply talk about the elements of a complex grant project, and many of these will also apply. Let's say if you want to do a fellowship-based project, you simply make it simpler, and some of those things can be stripped out. Both Marcia and Alina talked about letters of recommendation. For the bigger grants, that is not a requirement at all, simply because they'll be sent out to specialists, and they generate between 8 and 12 reports. So there is no need for additional letters of recommendation of the kind that you would need to produce for, let's say, a fellowship, a smaller grant in North America, or a job. And so while it's difficult to talk about all these different types of grants on various levels and with different objectives in the same breath, I will simply try to focus on this on these larger grants, because they will address so many of these points. So I suppose if you were to, let's say, aim for a large Canadian grant, or maybe one of these NEH or Mellon Fund grants that actually offer you substantial funding for a number of years, or in fact one of these European ones, I would suggest that the following are really elements that should be part of a complex and consistent, and I think especially successful grant. Often these competitions will tell you what they need very specifically, and again, my colleagues have already told you that it's very important that in your selection you choose something that is relevant. It will maximize your chances. It will minimize readers' time. And it will. I think it's the most efficient way of doing this, because these grants can take time. I mean, some of these I needed 6 to 8 months to actually generate and prepare. So it's important that you really think that you aim for a match. It simply has to be there, and the fit is absolutely vital. And of course, you need to make sure that you're eligible and that you follow every step. But in principle, when you start out, there should always be an introduction and a main objective. So the introduction sets the scene. It's not quite the same as the background specifically, but it introduces a general readership, because grants will always be read or vetted initially by either a panel or general readers, that is, academics who may not be in your discipline. In all likelihood, they will be in adjacent disciplines, or even if they are in your discipline, they will not have your specialization. And that's particularly vital, I think, information for someone coming out of a PhD, where I think specialization is such a key paradigm. So make sure that you introduce and set the context a little bit, why this is of relevance. But I should also want to include the main objective right away. So the main takeaway, what you want someone to understand about your project, it's the equivalent to the elevator pitch. And I think you should know the main objective and be able to articulate it if someone wanted to ask you, look, tell me in 2 or 3 sentences what your grant is about. And a lot of you have already been doing that and are doing that in relation to your PhD dissertation, because of course that needs to be rehearsed as well, and you have to be able to explain it to people who are not versed in the area. In the second section, the next step is really when you set the background, when you specifically situate your project, hopefully an ambitious one, in your discipline. But again, constantly, as Alina was saying, using language that people can understand. So imagine that you ask a colleague of yours or a peer who's in physics or chemistry and something entirely separate from what most of us are doing. What language would they use? How would they explain what they're doing to you so that you can understand it? And even within the humanities and social sciences, the rifts and the disciplines and the methodologies are so different that you really have to assume that level of separation. And also, in the background section, you should move to the so-called state of the field, or the state of the art, as sometimes called, somewhat sort of unfortunately. But you really want to show what's been done, what the nature of the research is at the moment, what the accomplishments are. And that should really create a case. So you say, look, here's what I want to do. That's what we know at the moment. And there is a difference. There is a gap. There is a genuine knowledge gap that needs to be plugged with your research. You really have to make a case for it. It's a simple case of, or a simple assignment here of persuasive writing. And then you generate, as a next step, the various objectives that sit under the main objectives. They should also be linked, always be linked to the main aim, and you should break them down into segments, or some of the more complex competitions will call them work packages, right? So that you say that you have a main objective, or let's say changing the world or changing your field in this particular area, or you want to show that A is B and C is D, and then make sure that your objectives that sit underneath it show how different components of your bigger project, of your bigger claim, your bigger argument will be researched by you and what you want to accomplish there. And they should not be just, you shouldn't be writing on this. You should be writing this on a sort of, as I said, I think Alina had this this pillar analogy. I think it's important that you don't talk about this in a vague way. It's vital that it's concrete at every step, and you explain the various elements of your main objective, the various segments, and you break them down, each work package or each segment, into a cycle that consists of a research component, an evaluation component, and a dissemination component that then feeds back into the next cycle. So they're quite finicky little machines that you need to generate in your writing. You then move to impact. And that's vital too, that you actually show what this will do. It's important throughout, I think, to be ambitious, but to be realistic, not to exaggerate what you're going to say, because at the end of the day, real experts will be asked to write a report and evaluation in a very sober way. But you have to show what the impact is on your field. And ideally, you should want to include some level of knowledge dissemination, of showing how what you say here is not simply relevant to your little area of interest, but it can go beyond it. And I think that component of justifying the humanities, I think it's worthwhile trying to work that into your workflow as your career develops, because it will become more and more important wherever you'll be working in the world. Then move to the approach. Show the angles from which you'll be approaching your topic, the theoretical underpinnings, the research school in your discipline that informs you, or the research schools. Ideally, you want to have multiple of them. And the most successful and complex project, especially in medieval studies, which is interdisciplinary, as we all know, and celebrate, have different components from different disciplines. So show the approaches that you have. And as a next stage, the methodology is vital here. It differs from approach because it will actually show the techniques and the phases of the project that you will be applying. And always you have to be specific here. And this particular section always benefits from a diagram in which you just render visually clear and understandable what you hope to achieve. And then bring in the deliverables, the actual outcome, ideally not just a monograph or another book, but you actually show how your project can add value beyond that, can create synergies that will not just lead to simply yet another book, but may include a book, but can actually go beyond it. So be quite concrete about the deliverables, what you will do academically, how many presentations will be given at conferences, how many workshops will be organized that will have an impact, or perhaps knowledge dissemination, how you will also spread knowledge and I think the insights and the outcomes of your research beyond just your narrowly defined field. Many grants then have a reference section towards the end. I mean, a budget is important, but again, they're so specific that I won't comment on this, except for one thing. Whatever grant you tend to apply for, especially of the bigger grants, I will always ask and create a budget that asks for the maximum, because you will generally be reduced anyway. Committees are often tasked with stripping down or stripping out elements that are not required. So the more you ask for, I think the better chances you have of getting quite a bit. But again, that that needs to be adjusted for particular competitions when that's not the case. I'm not going to say about anything about style other than what I've said already, and by implication, that you should always be precise, and you should be confident, I think, and cogent. Right, so it is much more matter of fact than your other writing. There really is no room for flourishes and the kind of stylistic choices that we get away with elsewhere. I mean, belletristic was Alina's term. I think that really hits the nail on the head. Be really precise. This is matter of fact. It's government white paper or government bill speech in a North American sense, right? And make sure that it's precise, that it's confident, and so that means not arrogant, but not tentative either, somewhere in between. And that what you say is cogent, because you'll be tested on the cogency either in an interview, if that's part of the assessment, or in the letters. Because with such low success rates, the pressure is to really find holes rather than praise projects for their excellence. But don't be, and this is just my final point, don't be put off by these success rates, because having sat on the other side of the table and having assessed so many of these grants, and again on different continents, my view is that generally half the grants in the competitions will not be that competitive. So you will probably, if you apply yourself, if you put a lot of preparation into it, if you control all the elements that you can control before you send off the grant, then I think you'll probably be in the upper half anyway, or in the top third, in my experience. And then the numbers dwindle, they're smaller. And I should also say that they're actually very good for projects that in general have a DH component, something material, the drawn archives, whether they're historical or literary or art historical or otherwise. And if you looked at a range of successful projects in Europe, in the various countries, or in fact grants awarded by the ERC, the European Research Council, which holds the biggest budget, you'll find that medieval projects, or projects on medieval topics and on classical topics, are disproportionately overrepresented. They do very well. So there is a lot of money for this. There is a lot of money for starting a career in this way, comfortably with research time, doing what you really want to do, without well, put it this way, I think in a realistic way. It needs preparation. So if any of you have any sort of further questions about that, happy to either talk today, of course, and then over email as well, if you have concrete ideas or plans. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Sebecki. We'll move on next to Mark Cruz, who is Associate Professor of French Art at Arizona State University. He has published on medieval theater manuscripts, heraldry and manuscript illumination, King Charles V's renovation of the Louvre, color in medieval European literature, Alexander the Great and the Crusades, European perceptions of the Mongols, and place in contemporary Haitian literature. He has edited or co-edited 3 volumes and is the co-translator of the memoirs of Catherine the Great. His current book projects focus on a manuscript of Christine de Pizan's Epistle of Othia, which is co-authored with Gabriel Perusa, and on the representation of the Mongols in late medieval France. His grants include the Institute for Advanced Study and the National Humanities Center. Dr. Cruz?
Thank you, Reed. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a professor of French literature, but I work in art history as well. Thank you, Reed. So I've been asked to discuss the application process from a reviewer's point of view, what reviewers look for, and what are common problems that make an application fall through. I will do this informally like Marcia and Sebastian. I have no presentation to give, but I will be relaying comments in order, and hopefully that will make it all very clear. So my experience, first of all, with reviewing grants is much like my colleagues. I'm an annual reviewer for the National Humanities Center and for the Institute for Advanced Study. I've been on the final selection committee for the National Humanities Center, and I routinely am asked to vet grants internationally and within my own home institution at Arizona State. So a lot of what I'm going to say has actually been said, but I think that it probably bears repeating. So bear with me. First thing I want to point out is that when you get to the review stage, there are usually 2 levels of review. An application will generally be sent to specialists or to people with related experience. So as someone who's in French, I have been asked to do first round reviews for applications related to French literature or history in non-medieval periods. And then those applications that are well reviewed in the first round will go to the final committee. And this committee will usually be composed of people from a wide range of disciplines. This has already been addressed by Professor Gutzman. And some of these people may well be outside of the humanities, depending on the organization that you're applying to. But one thing to keep in mind, and we'll come back to this, is if the grant is humanities focused, very frequently the review panel will have a plurality or even a majority of historians. And that is worth keeping in mind, and as we will see momentarily. So as has already been noted, you are in effect writing for 2 audiences, and you need to simultaneously show command of your material, and you need to make your argument accessible to non-specialists. So you have to put yourself in the committee's shoes. And this is exactly what Professor Gutzman is saying. I cannot emphasize this enough. People may be reading dozens of applications. Certainly the final review committee will be reading many, many applications. When Dr. Kupfer was talking earlier about numbers of applications, I can tell you that 2 years ago, the National Humanities Center had about 660 applications, and about 45 of those were funded. So the final application committee was asked to review about 150 applications, and we had to read all of those. So those are the numbers that we're talking about. So I'm sure that you have all heard this very often, but it bears repeating. The first paragraph, and at most the first 2 paragraphs of any application need to answer, so what? You have to explain at the very beginning, clearly and succinctly, what you are studying and why it is important. Now, when I speak with my students or junior colleagues about this, the way that I explain this is you can break it down very simply. And in fact, any research project involves 2 things. It involves a corpus and it involves a question. There is the thing that you are studying, the body of material, which can be anything from cathedrals to vestments to archaeological remains to texts, whatever it is. And then you have a question, and that's what you want to know. And as Professor Sabiki just said, you should be able to articulate that in an elevator speech. You should have a 20 or 30-second version, a 2 or 3 sentence version of that question that you can keep in mind as you are working up your project. And this corpus and question structure can help you, I think, navigate a lot of the issues and also manage a lot of the insecurities that come up as you're writing your grant. So that corpus and question structure needs to be very clear at the beginning of an application. Then you need to position yourself in relation to previous scholarship in the field. So what that means is you have to address very quickly, again, very succinctly at the beginning, what are you building on, or what conversation are you contributing to? And then you also have to explain what is new, interesting, or exciting about your research. So this is all what has to happen in the first 2 paragraphs. If I'm reading 150 applications, then I need to know off the bat that you have thought about this clearly, that you have boiled it down, distilled it, and that you can present a cogent and compelling argument about your work. Now, as you get into the body of your presentation and your application, you need to use clear transitions, you need to use signposting, and you above all need to use topic sentences that lead the reader from one section and one idea to the next. You need to repeat key terms. And so my advice is that you think of a proposal as a story. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or if you prefer, an introduction, a development, and a conclusion. But you need to feel that flow as you're writing it and as you're rereading and editing it, you need to put yourself in the shoes of the non-specialist, the person who's not in your head. It is the exact same process that you will use in any writing you do, whether it be articles or longer form research. It's exactly as Dr. Kupfer said. You have to think of this as a rehearsal for a longer form research essay or book. A final thing I would say about what reviewers are looking for is creative or unexpected combinations, either within the corpus or between the corpus and the methodology. So I'm going to give you an example that is not medieval. When I was reviewing for the National Humanities Center a few years ago, I still recall a proposal that examined advertisements for and discourses around the consumption of meat in 19th and 20th century America, but it examined these through the lens of gender theory. And it had this very compelling and at first very strange, but ultimately really remarkable way of getting the reader to think about the fact that the way that we talk about and depict animals that we eat and the human body, the gendered body in American society, is actually very similar, that there is this Venn diagram with a lot of overlap. This was original, it was striking, it was well thought out, it was funded. And so this is worth thinking about. What is it, or how can you present your work in a way that shows that it is striking, that it is interesting? Now, within our own field, one might think, for example, of Caroline Bynum's Jesus as Mother. Boom, that's great. Just from a purely grant application perspective, from a branding or a marketing perspective, that is a great title. Jesus as Mother, taking two things that you've not commonly thought of together and putting them together. So that can be a very winning strategy if you are trying to break through the noise of multiple applications and trying to grab the attention of an overworked academic application reviewer. Now, this brings me to common problems. And again, much of this has been touched on, but it bears repeating. And I would say that number one, or certainly at the top, is the use of jargon or specialized terminology. And this applies both to terms related to primary and secondary sources, or another way to put it is to corpus and methodology. So what do I mean? Clear terminology is especially important in medieval studies, where many of the phenomena that we study are not part of even an educated person's vocabulary. So examples that just sprang to mind are dynamic geometry, if you're working on architecture, inquest, if you're working in medieval law, supersessionism, if you're working on theology. These are not everyday terms. You have to define these up front if these terms are crucial to what you are working on. At the same time, you should not assume that reviewers are familiar with the theoretical and critical terminology that you use. Examples from the past, say, 15 years would be hypertext, metatextual, post-human, interrogation. So you have got to be very clear in how you express yourself. You should not assume that readers are familiar with this verbiage. And I emphasize this as well because we often fall back on especially contemporary critical theoretical terminology because we are insecure, because we think that this makes us sound smart. Trust me, I was in grad school in French in the 90s, okay, the high water mark of theory. And I'm not actually very theoretical. And the problem with this language is that it often is difficult to use properly. Often people who use it aren't fully familiar with the histories, with the etymologies and the etiologies of these terms. And therefore the terms fall flat, or they don't do the work they're supposed to do. Or you could use a 25-cent word when you're trying to use a 50-cent word. So please be very careful about clarity. Now, a second problem concerns overemphasis on methodology at the expense of argument. You do have to explain how you will analyze your corpus. But what is most interesting to the reviewer is what you are asking of the material and what you hope to show. So another way to put this is, do not let methodology drive your project. Your question comes first and dictates your methodology. Even if you have a methodology that fascinates you or that is innovative and remarkable and clever, it has to be tied to a clearly defined question or problem. And the example that I often see these days concerns digital humanities. So DH has extraordinary algorithms, extraordinary computing power. There are all kinds of things we can do with digital technologies. But does the algorithm and what it produces actually add up to anything? Is there anything new that's produced? And very frequently you will read projects or just discuss with people who are thinking about putting a proposal together, and they'll talk a lot about the algorithm. They'll talk about a lot about what the app can do. But when you get to what the output is, it doesn't contribute anything, okay? So if you have a project like that, it's not going to satisfy reviewers at all. They're going to see through that, okay? Because eventually you've got to give us the deliverables. So watch out. Do not overemphasize methodology at the expense of argument. And then related to that is simply the problem of failing to balance the various elements of the application, spending too much time on methodology or argument or conclusions, results. You have to make sure that all of those are given equal time and that they all are integrated in a meaningful and compelling manner that is clear, that one leads necessarily to the other. A fourth problem is the no payoff problem. After explaining your question and methodology, the result is something obvious or something others have observed or something that does not make a significant contribution to the field. Now, this is especially common when people bring in methods or materials from outside of their discipline. I've read numerous applications, especially in recent years, with the rise of interdisciplinarity. Literature people, for example, who suddenly want to do image-text relationships. Well, if you're someone who actually hasn't taken graduate courses in art history or done the spade work to get to know the critical methodologies and terminologies of art history, it's going to be very hard for you to say something original and meaningful in the realm of art history. So interdisciplinarity is great, but you have to make sure that you have indeed mastered the other field or fields and make sure that you are doing something original, something that adds up to something. This is obvious, but I think that it needs to be said, especially in the current climate. Avoid a disparaging or aggressive tone. Professor Getzman touched on this as well. My advice is that you not insult or deprecate previous scholarship or other scholars. And that may seem obvious, but at this point, there's more and more heated rhetoric in certain pockets of the humanities, and obviously in our general culture. The general culture, I think, is having a negative effect on scholarly discourse to a certain extent. If you disagree with others' research, if you find it lacking, explain why in a clear manner that sticks to the facts. Being dismissive does not equate to being smart. Another problem is rhetorical excess. So repeatedly stating that your work is original, innovative, etc. As my dissertation advisor said, show, don't tell. It's not enough to assert. You have to back up the assertion. So if something is interesting or new or innovative, you have to explain why. You simply can't state it as a fact. Give examples. And a related problem is trying to do too much or making grandiose claims. So we all want our projects to stand out, and we may believe that our project will change the world, but your project needs to focus again on a specific question and corpus. Do not wander into disciplinary or critical territory that does not contribute to your analysis. And in particular, where this really comes up is avoiding the temptation to include elements that are trending, but do not really add anything. So in the current climate, this might be digital humanities, or it might be discourses related to race. Well, ask yourself, are these fields, first of all, with which you are truly familiar? And secondly, do these very currently popular fields or discourses relate truly to what you are trying to show? Very often you see people trying to shoehorn in things that are trending almost as an afterthought. And it's obvious, it comes out in an application. And so there's no need to do that. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, be true to yourself. Have that conversation with yourself. Be very mindful from the beginning. What is it I'm trying to show? What is my question? And then stick to that. Similarly, proposing to do too much. You know, people who say, oh, in my year at the National Humanities Center, at my year at the IAS, in my year at the IAS in Paris, I'm going to write 2 books. Or I will do all the research and I'll write the book. No, people can see right through that. Be very honest about where you are, what you've done. And what this can mean is you may really be gunning to apply for something and you're just not ready. Admit it. There's nothing wrong with not being ready. You should apply at the moment that you are ready to apply. Now I come back to what I said about historians being very prevalent on application committees. Chronology is your friend. Just in general, as a structuring principle, chronology is your friend, especially for those of us working in medieval studies. So it frequently happens that you are so familiar with the historical context of your material that you forget to tell or to remind the reader. It's not enough to say Carolingian X or Gothic Y. You need to give dates so that people know where they are in time. So chronological references are especially important for us because most readers will not be familiar with medieval history, and certainly not to the degree that we are. And then a final point, it's so obvious, but it's such a bugbear for reviewers. Don't go over the word limit. Read the instructions. I mean, they're there for a reason. As Dr. Kupfer said, as Professor Getzmann said, as Professor Subicki said, the instructions are there for a reason, not just for eligibility, not just to make sure it matches what you're doing, but you must strictly respect the format. Because trust me, once you have read 20 or 30 applications and then you get to one and you see that it goes on for 5 pages when the limit was 3, you're not going to read it. It will be dismissed out of hand. So if you're going to put in the time to do an application, make sure that you dot all of your I's, cross all of your T's, and respect all of the instructions. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. We now will move on to our final speaker. Roger Martinez Davila is an associate professor of history at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and serves as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow for the Graduate School. His first monograph, Creating Conversos, the Carvajal Santa Maria family in early modern Spain, was published in 2018. His latest scholarship centers around the regeneration of medieval worlds using immersive reality technologies. Efforts to develop this work are materializing with the awarding of the 2021 to 2023 National Endowment for the Humanities grant. Specifically, he and a colleague, Dr. Lynn Ramey of Vanderbilt University, developed an institute for advanced topics in the digital humanities titled the Immersive Global Middle Ages, which empowers faculty, museum specialists, and cultural creators to make their own digital virtual reality worlds that reveal the Middle Ages through different religious and cultural lenses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reed and Christopher and Jonathan, for this kind invitation to be here. I just have to say, like, wow, this is incredible. I've heard such expertise and experience and great advice. And I'm grateful to actually to be at the end, because I think I will go back and play this session, because there's so many really great ideas about the kind of the do's, the don'ts, approaches, all the intricacies of applying for grants. So keep this one in your back pocket. This is a great one. So thank you to my colleagues. I think what I was asked to speak about this kind of transition from working on smaller research projects, smaller grants, and moving into larger grants. And the first place I think I would probably start with is just get accustomed to writing constantly, writing lots and lots of grants. Now, I'm not saying that in respect just throwing in grants, but I'm just saying just in the same way that in our own respective fields, we have to learn that language of crafting the language of like a historical research paper or article. Proposals really are that same format, this kind of active voice, this kind of direction to, speaking like, why is your research needed now? And, what is the problem it's solving? What is it innovate? How is it innovating? Or how is it really going to transform the field? Those things are very important. Now, one of the pieces I would really emphasize, and these are going to be more of the soft elements, and since I'm speaking the end, is first, I would say look outward. We're medievalists. Look outward out of the United States. And this is like Sebastian and the colleagues in the room. The European Research Council, Horizon 2020 grants, that world outside is much more generous than ours in the United States. There are fundamentally different approaches and beliefs about the value of culture and history and language. So immediately, in fact, my first grant was actually an ERC grant as a Marie Curie Fellow. And it was, precisely because of trying to find, creating relationships with other institutions and looking outward, that I was able to start to work on those initiatives. And to come home, had to be successful abroad to be successful at home. So I would say, right away, look outward, look at those other kind of grant opportunities in the international arena. And then because they're just more plentiful, and then seek out those collaborators, especially if you're a junior, on your way and junior, you can always offer your expertise for folks that are trying to assemble their own ideas. I think simply in some ways by looking at the publication records of folks that you find interesting and what they're working on, to reach out to make those connections, to say, hey, they don't know you're there. And often the hardest part, and this is where I was going to switch to, is finding collaborators. Often, when we're moving from kind of smaller grants to larger grants, especially like on an NEH DH grant, it is about the relationships that you're presenting. And those relationships, I think, communicate a certain level of expertise that you might not have, and you recognize it, and you've said, you know what, I'm good at this space, but you know what, we've reached out to these other folks. And so in this case, in most recent grant that we wrote, the idea was we reached out broadly to 15 different colleagues that we knew maybe half of them, to say, this is the idea, this is how we think your research and your work fits with ours, and we think we can kind of create some harmonies here. And so in that way, it's also about being kind of selfless, which is really thinking about your colleagues as collaborators and ways of actually growing their careers alongside of your own. It's not a zero-sum game. It's pie building, right? We start with this one pie, but we're going to build out together. So, and that's really kind of exciting, I think, at a certain level, which is kind of, most of us are in institutions where we don't get to spend time with other experts in our fields. So it's really important to kind of reach out to find those collaborators. Another piece that I might speak to is, and this is kind of a softer piece too. Often I think about all of these grants, especially as we're transitioning to the larger ones, it's kind of a little bit about the right person, the right project at the right time. And a lot of that is, creating those kind of alignments is really important. So do you bring the right expertise to this particular project, what you're investigating? Or if you don't have those, how can you supplement yours to create the right team to work on something? Is it the right project? Which is exactly what I think folks have been talking about today. We really want to generate projects that answer the call for proposals. You might have a lovely idea, but unless it's not tuned specifically to the needs of that particular grant or fellowship, then it won't happen. So be really kind of particular about those projects and be able to shift a little bit. So I often think about like moving sideways. So I'm very interested in I'm first of all, confessions, historian, digital humanist. That's going to probably, put me in a different category. But I think what's important is to assemble those right teams working together. I think the right timing is often, something that's entirely out of your control. You might just get lucky at times that your project is on an ascent in terms of there's a real interest in it. I think it's smart to avoid kind of like these overly timely topics to shoehorn things in. As Marcus has said, it is pretty obvious. You do want to really kind of make sure that that you're proposing something that is substantive and real and not just a trend. And you can't predict those trends. That's just impossible. I think the last thing that I would kind of would add here, and it's two components, which is it's really important to know when not to apply. So presently, I'm working with some colleagues at the University of Colorado System for a grant, and we've had a couple two meetings. It's just not the right team. It's not the right team. It's not the right project. And it's not the right time. And it's important to kind of recognize that because you have limited time. So kind of trust that gut instinct. Be thankful for the relationship you made, because in the future, some of those same people might be reassembled for another opportunity. But it's important to be able to like walk away, right? Because you've got to be really judicious with your time. And this is the last piece I would leave it with, which is ultimately it's all just about persistence. And all of you, as you're working on your graduate programs and as you move through your careers, this is what we're trained to do. We're trained to be persistent. My expectation, and I know the other people in the room here today, is I'm an expert at failure. And I love that, actually. I love failing because I get the feedback from my colleagues through grant proposals, and they say, what were you thinking? This would never work. Or like, that's interesting. But all that cumulative failure, it's like, okay, I tried to build it this way, this way, this way, this way. Those things didn't work, but all of eventually you'll start to get the right kind of connections, the right kind of compositions. And that is what you really need. So it was always my expectation, and it generally has been the rule of thumb. I'm perhaps might win 10% of the things that I apply for. I've applied for NEH, different kinds of NEH projects. I think 7 times we finally just won one. And so, I mean, it was like, oh, we beat the 10%. That's incredible. So, be ready for that kind of failure and then kind of embrace it and like, okay, let's learn from this and let's keep moving forward. So, thanks very much for allowing me to visit with this really great panel.
Thank you so much. And it's so nice to end on such a nice note. Well, please, everyone, I know with the webinar format, it's hard to express your gratitude to our speakers, but please join me in thanking all of them for sharing their insights and expertise with us. We now have ample time for questions. Some of them have already come in through the Q&A function. Please, as they come to you, put them there, and we can start off going through some of these. So let's see, we have a first question from Savannah Bishop. She says, hello, thank you to the organizers for putting this together and for the speakers for sharing their advice and experience. I would love to know if the speakers would recommend certain places to check or resources to utilize to find grant opportunities, either now or that they would suggest for earlier career scholars. Thank you. And if anyone would like to jump in, just raise your hand.
I mean, I'll take a stab at this. I think I mean, there's the low-hanging fruit kind of approach, right? So, American Council of Learned Societies, there's Mellon, they're all the, really, really large names. So you should, I know as a graduate student, I had a really good habit of actually just creating a list of bookmarks of major institutions that I knew were funding kind of the type of work I was interested in. And I would just kind of on a routine basis, every couple of months, take a look at and see what was happening there right away. And often those are kind of links over to other ones. So part of it is just kind of keeping in the same way that we do like our scholarly like research and reading of like historiography. You want to do the same thing, is create that kind of like that group of places you want to go. The other thing that I found is really effective, and this helped me when I was at the University of Texas at Austin, is I actually searched other university graduate programs websites where they listed opportunities. So I went to University of Michigan and I was like, oh, they have this great list of grants. I didn't even know that existed. So other people are doing the work for you. So look at the major, I think, R1 institutions and see what do they provide to their students to help them find resources. I think that's another great way of finding things. Also, obviously, looking through the European Research Council, typing that in alone will help you find a lot of things in terms of like really looking outward. And I think that's probably a good place to start.
So I think that's exactly right. That's fantastic. Your universities should have a list of resources. They should. Many don't. And so approach your director of graduate studies and say, we don't have a list. But look, Case Western Reserve University does. Why don't we? Can we have it? Can we make it better? This is how ours came about. When I, got to be a DGS in my first year, we had nothing. And then graduate students approached me and said, we have nothing. And so I sat down and put together a list of resources, and now we have something. And I tried to update it on a regular basis, and I fail, but students help. So yes, you should go to other universities, but you should also attempt to have your own list on your website.
And if I could add to that, Tembi asked earlier where to look for grants related to migration, for example. So another place you can go if you are affiliated with the university, either as a graduate student or a faculty member. Many universities also have a grants team. Often these people are affiliated with or housed in your humanities research institutes. And often these groups, these teams of research people, humanities research people, are not well advertised. Often the humanities institutes or the dean's offices do not do a good job of getting the word out about the existence of these people, especially at large universities. So I would also say, if you have a humanities institute, contact them, and also just contact the Dean of Humanities and see if there are any resources affiliated with the humanities units that might have information about grants as well.
And if I can just jump in quickly, and I think in addition, I think just to expand on what Roger was saying. I mean, if you're interested in European grants, the ESC definitely that's one place to look, and that's probably the sort of biggest pot. But every European country has its own national agency. Sort of, it's a bit like a supersized NEH, even for those small countries, much more generous. And so you really have to look at individual universities in these countries and look for their grants overview page or whatever it is. And these will be really easy to find. They'll be very visible. They're usually not behind some kind of intranet wall, for the simple reason because there's just so much of those around. And if I could just very gently disagree with Roger, yes, the grants here, I mean, are large and generous, but not because we prize education so much or research, but because we're stingy with university funding. So our public universities get so much less money, have to be very efficient, and we have to fight for that money. So it looks wonderful, but there is a darker side to this, right? But still, it means that most of these are open, and it's not just the big EU ones. I mean, within the UK, and I keep coming back to the countries where I've worked in the longest outside of the UK, and that's the Netherlands and Germany. These grants are generally open to everyone, irrespective of where they're starting, as long as they're willing to do them in one of the member states. So there's a whole landscape out there, and I'm always happy to sort of maybe that's something for Mark and this committee of ours to perhaps start commissioning a few lists that we can put together. I'm happy to sort of pull my weight there. Not that I want to create more work for the others, but at least for Europe, I'm happy to get started on that. But we have so many resources in the academy, and so many colleagues who know their own national markets so well. I'm sure we can pull that off.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for that thorough answer. Next, we have a question from Sam Truman asking about whether our speakers could discuss how the pandemic has changed the grant writing landscape and how to overcome issues of networking during the pandemic that seems so tied to grant writing.
I don't want to hog the microphone here, but again, collaboration hasn't really been disrupted that much by the pandemic in many ways. Certain forms of networks are not available or they are artificial. But I think after 2 years, we've all become quite fluent in this. I think this no longer fits, it doesn't feel awkward what we're actually doing here. 2 years ago would have felt slightly out of place. And I think what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the forms of, a lot of the practices that we do in our daily work as researchers, whether you write your PhD dissertation or your next book, they are actually externalized and formalized in the grant writing process. So it's not that artificial. It's the same step as between, let's say, a Zoom meeting and a real meeting or a real conference. And collaboration is one of those aspects. We always collaborate. If you want to place an article in Speculum somewhere else, make sure that you know to whom to send it to. And as your career advances, you know that there are certain colleagues who will cast a critical eye on this, or whose judgment you trust, or who know more about an area that you need to investigate, whether it's in your field or, as Mark was saying, another discipline. So you always collaborate. We're never really isolated, even though we end up writing our papers and our articles and our books on our own. And I think that's not prevented by the pandemic. So, if anything, we're always, someone's always happy to interact with another colleague in their field of interest. After all, we're here and we work on our topics because we love them. I'm sure our skills could be monetized so much better elsewhere. So we're doing this as a matter of choice because we love it. And if anything, most of us have a tendency to give too much time to what we do. So I'm sure that generosity is reciprocal. So. And the pandemic, if anything, has really created new channels of working together, I find, for all the undesirable aspects of it.
Well, I would just, to jump in here, I would say that one way that the pandemic has had a negative impact is on the ability to travel to places and look at actual works of art and museum collections, or to use archives. And so that kind of specificity that you want for a grant proposal is somewhat hampered if you can't find what you're looking for online with ease. So, that's been difficult, at least for me. And then, there's a civil war in Ethiopia. I'm just not going there for any research that I want to do. So that, that does have an impact. But I wanted to ask my own question a little bit to Sebastian and Roger, and that is, if you could explain the transition, or from working as an individual on an individual research topic, and I'm an independent scholar, so I don't have any university support whatsoever. So no labs, no digital humanity, nothing. I do my own research projects. So then how do you find those larger grants to become a part of? I mean, is it realistic for just someone who's an independent scholar to approach an ERC thing, like look it up and, you know, I think that there are different steps, you know, how do you manage that transition from the individual fellowship to a multi-year, multi-person, you know, project to work on in the European sense?
Roger, shall I go first?
Sure.
Unless you want to. I suppose most of the grants that I've applied for were actually individual grants. So even though when I talk about scale and you know, generosity in terms of funding, they're still individual grants. They're built around an individual's idea, a project. They may have people who work on the grant, and sort of the typical European large grant system is three-tiered. So there is the ESC that has those three tiers: starting, consolidator, and advanced grant, and they are replicated throughout the various countries. So the first is entry level, usually right after your PhD or the first 2 years, and then there are the sort of middle ones, and it usually is counted in years since the PhD. So by around 15, 16 years past the PhD, you get to that more senior project. And I mean, generally, the objective of that is not just to do your own research, but to train the next generation of researchers. So you would usually ask in your funding for a postdoc to work with you, perhaps 1 or 2 PhD students. And of course, when you start out on the first level, that's not a big team. And effectively, you actually train them, you pass on some of your knowledge, and that starts very early in the European system. So you know, right out of the gates when you get your PhD. So, but essentially, they're still individual grants. There are collaborative grants as well, and there are network grants and all kinds of things with 80 and more researchers, and then it gets really crazy. I've never applied for those. They are sort of beyond my intellectual grasp. My head's even smaller than Alina's, so I couldn't do that. But what I'm trying to say is, it really depends on the competition. Some of those grants unfortunately require an institutional affiliation, and that is the perennial problem that works against independent scholars. But again, I mean, I think someone of your stature and your track record in terms of both fellowships, securing, you know, what we call third-party funding here in Europe, and publications, would not have any difficulty or not be disadvantaged in applying for one of those grants. I think, again, it comes down to finding the right type of grant in terms of size, career level, and fit. As Roger was saying, the fit needs to be there. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but in my case, I always wait for the grant idea to come to me. So when I have a project that I really want to do, and I realize, you know, this is more than just a book or an article. This is something that, you know, it will require archival work that may need digital processing, or may need something else that is just more than I would normally find in my path. Then I look for a grant. Then I look for a format, and I think that would be. It's a clumsy answer, but I think that would be my initial response.
Sebastian, thank you so much for like all that expertise. I mean, that helps a ton. I did, you know, put a quick link into the ERC funding links, and if you'll see there are actually, you know, even links for funding for non-European researchers. I think one of the the question is right on spot on, which is like, how do I get my foot in the door, right? How do I make that bridge? And I only can maybe speak to my own experience. So, you know, having the opportunity to, you know, securing like an individual fellowship at a Spanish institution then allowed me to create like a short-term relationship, a 3-year relationship with a university in Madrid. The great thing about that is then now once I was into that institution, just as a fellow, I could then start to apply as a researcher as a part of that university system. And generally, most of the, especially Spanish universities, they are constantly like really, I would say, provoking like their faculty to say, you've got to go out and find funding. You've got to find funding, look for it, apply for things. And they made all kinds of resources available to me that were not accessible in the United States in terms of like proofreading services, folks that actually read and help prepare proposals, workshopping of projects, substantial types of support. A real specific thing that I would recommend is, and what I'm doing now is actually reaching back out to that same institution, saying, I think there is a proper ERC grant that is a good fit for me, but also for these other folks at your institution. What if, I would like to propose through your institution, and I'm going to ask for a post. I'm going to ask for a post that's not a real post, but on paper, you've named me as one of your, affiliated researchers for the center of whatever. And the great thing about that is it is like a no loss for you and for the institution. They're not paying you anything. In fact, you're bringing an opportunity to them and creating like the potentiality that they could realize actually some significant funding. So in that respect, I would reach out to, those respective kind of like centers for historiography, or folks that you work with, or folks at individual research councils. And this is again that networking of offering your kind of expertise, and suggesting I certainly could throw in on this project and be a participant in that respect. The one thing I did want to mention, because I don't want you all to think that any of these grants are the holy grail of things. When you win like a NEH grant through your institution or ERC grant, they are huge, what we have to call taxes that are placed on your grants. So each institution will charge what is called an indirect cost rate. So for instance, you might win a $300,000 grant, but your university might take anywhere between 40 and 60% of those dollars to fund the institution. So this is just to say, be really careful about what you're proposing and then knowing what you're getting into. It burns me up to no end that this happens, but it's the cost of admission.
Can I just add two quick footnotes to that? Not to disagree, but to say that in Europe we call that overheads, and they're capped at 20% usually. So that's a little bit more favorable. And just one more thing is that there's a tendency, it's become formalized through law in the Netherlands, but it's also happening in Germany and elsewhere, that if you secure one of those large national grants, and again, the success rate is 10 to 50% in the humanities, the university has to offer you a permanent job. So I'm just saying that that actually is a law now. We can no longer accept those grants if we don't offer them a permanent job afterwards. And you don't have to have a job and work in the Netherlands or in Europe or be a citizen or whatever when you apply. So I'm just saying that's it's not the holy grail. I totally agree with you. I mean, you're spot on. But those are avenues, and we have a lot of Americans who get those grants and come to work here, right? So just as an idea.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Cruz, I noticed that you unmuted. Did you have a comment or question to make?
Oh, this is going back to the discussion about how the pandemic has affected networking. I would just say that I know that there are various groups and networks within medieval studies that have been having basically ad hoc online seminars or mini conferences. And I would go back to something that Dr. Kupfer and Professor Gertzman said, which is there's a certain degree of just being fearless and putting yourself out there. And I think that if anything, the pandemic has made it more acceptable to simply contact somebody, say, I saw you give a presentation on Zoom. I thought it was great. This is what I'm interested in. Could we talk more? Even arranging a Zoom meeting with somebody. I think the technology has actually made it more acceptable to reach out to people. And so if you are a graduate student, or if you are a junior professor, or if you're an independent scholar, and you are trying to figure out a way to meet with people, do not hesitate to contact people. And look, I mean, most of us are nice, right? I mean, medievalists tend to be pretty nice people, and we want to help and we want to network. So by all means, just put yourself out there.
Awesome.
And I would add to that, and Sam knows that being my student, that when you contact people, do also talk to your advisor, right? Because if your advisor lets you, as I tend to, you can just take their name and say, I am such and such a student, working on. And while, Professor Cruz is right, medievalists by and large are just the nicest bunch. It's true, it's wonderful. Sometimes you want to, you might get a better answer, or you might get a faster answer if you mention somebody, because we all know each other by and large. So it's not a bad idea to also say, can I throw your name out there, and see if I get a good response.
Fantastic. Thank you both. With only about 10 minutes remaining, let's try and dive through some of these student questions. We have a question from Daniel Davies saying, could the panelists please describe a light bulb moment they had related to grantsmanship, that moment when they realized, oh, right, that's how it works, or, oh, right, that's what my project's impact is, or how it changed their approach to grants.
Okay, I can very quickly go, because for me, it really was when I was writing the application. So let me again repeat, right? I did not get any grants or fellowships when I was a graduate student. There was no pipeline for me. And when I was out of grad school, I was, first a visiting assistant professor. Then for 5 years, I was at the institution that did not open any doors for me. So didn't help. So when I was putting together my ACLS application, and that was for the absent image book, and I really had no hope, because the rejections were just piling up, all the job rejections and grant rejections. And, there was a drawer full of rejections, and I was weeping to my reference letter writers, and they were just going, we also have a drawer full of rejections. You're fine. I put together that application, and I did have this moment of deep satisfaction, like, this is good. This is right. Now, this was for my, fourth book? Well, I didn't know that I'll write the 50 objects. So really third, I thought it was my third book. And I never had that. It was just this, oh, even if it doesn't get funded, this is really good. And then it got funded, and I was in deep shock because that moment passed already, and I thought I will never get any money. So that's my story.
I would like to say that I don't agree with the premise of the question. I don't think that we all have moments like Professor Gutzman had. I certainly have not. I think that what Professor Martinez Davila said about persistence has been key in my success. It's just trying and trying and trying, and getting to a point where you're satisfied enough with the grant application, but deadline's coming up, you've done what you can on it, and out it goes. So what I'm trying to say is, you don't have to have that kind of moment to have success, and don't wait for it. Don't expect it. Just keep trying.
Agreed.
Yes, and it's a skill. It's a skill that you just have to learn and master, and but you will get better at trying, and ultimately at grant writing. That's the only thing I can say. But yeah, I haven't found the answer either, and sometimes it works. Most of the times it doesn't, and but you will also get feedback. That's the other thing. And a lot of competitions, depending on the grant, you will get feedback, and that will make your next attempt better.
Great, thank you all for sharing that. We also have an anonymous attendee who apologizes for showing up late, but had a question about after receiving a rejection, whether it is appropriate to ask for improvement or from feedback.
Yeah, I can answer that. it's only appropriate if the website instructions for the venue say that you can do that. The only two that I know you can ask for such feedback are the NEH and the ACLS. Now, I'm not an expert on, there may be other grants out there, maybe the ERC does that, but if it doesn't explicitly state, then you're not going to get any feedback.
Great, thank you. We have another question from another anonymous attendee who asks about if a page or word count is not given, rare, but they've come across them, what should the length of the proposal and cover letter be? Also, are bullet or numbered points acceptable for certain sections of a proposal?
I mean, I would say that if no specifications are given, it's probably fine to email the administrator in charge and just ask, maybe not for the bullet points, but for word count / page count. That would be that. And otherwise, as for covering letters, I mean, my colleagues may correct me here. I would apply the same benchmark as for covering letters for jobs. And I think for academic jobs, I think 2 is about right. I wouldn't go beyond that. Some people think it's fine, especially if they're senior. I still think a 2-page letter looks good. 1 page is, if you apply for a job in business, I would say 2 pages is traditional. And I would keep the same principle if there are no other specifications, but I think it's perfectly fine to ask.
Excellent, thank you.
I'd like to address the bullet points issue. I would be wary about that because what it suggests to at least myself is that you have not actually thought about how all the points are integrated together into an argument. And it suggests that you have sort of thrown things together. So I think it's still better to try to craft a narrative than to have bullet points.
Perfect, that's super helpful. We also have another attendee asking about, they say, although I understand there is no magic number, how many fellowships should one do after the PhD, postdocs, before applying for full-time posts? Can it hurt to do too many fellowships or postdocs?
Okay, there are no jobs in art history. So my answer would be you apply for everything and you don't wait to apply for a full-time job and try to do a postdoc first. You just go for everything and see where you land.
Great, thank you. If there was else has any comments. We have another question that says, thank you for all of you sharing your expertise. Question is about something that Professor Roger Martinez-Davila said, have previously said. You said it is important to know when it is the right time to apply. Could you explain this a little bit more, please?
I think others are going to have really good responses to this. I think it's back to right person, right project, right time. And so the right time is really would be tuned to, is this the right call for proposals that is tuned to my ideas? It also relates to where you are in your scholarly career, which I think folks were discussing. So it would be entirely inappropriate as a junior person to apply for something very senior. You just won't be competitive, right? So you want to, apply for the opportunity that is designed for your pedigree and your moment in time. So like those ERC starter grants are for like junior scholars up to a certain number of years. So the other piece I would add to that about the right time is, and it hasn't been said here, but it's important. Take a look at where your personal life is too and your professional life is too. Because let's say if you have a young family or you're planning on a big move, or there's some health or sickness issue and a family, I'm not sure what those are, but it's really hard to be successful at writing these grants if you're under a lot of other kind of stresses. That this will not, adding something else to it is not going to make it better. So everybody knows how to judge that for themselves. But I think it's important to just be honest with yourself and say, hey, it's okay. It's okay. I might pass on this one, but I'm going to work on the next one. So be attentive to your personal state.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I actually think that that folded well into the last question we had outstanding. But as it is 2 o'clock, I don't want to keep anyone over time. So I want to say thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your insights and experiences with grant writing. I also want to thank our GSC chair, Jonathan Correa, who's been our fearless leader on the GSC this past year. And also to say thank you to Christopher Cole and everyone else at the MAA who made this possible. And as a reminder, this workshop was recorded and it will be available soon on the Medieval Academy's YouTube page. So thank you so much.